So I'll play a little game with you.
All right.
I'm a pastor.
Yep.
Brother Joe has embezzled $100,000.
Yeah.
And it's out on Twitter right now. I'm thinking we just let it ride out.
Yeah.
Let's try to handle this and see if he can pay it back, and let's not say anything to anybody in the church. Is that a good philosophy? What would you say to me?
Are you crazy?
The golden hour, hey, any way you slice it, Tennessee is a mission field. The golden hour, hey, everyone's invited, we making changes and that's for real. The golden hour, let's go.
Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Golden Hour. My name is Matt Tullis.
And I'm Beth Moore.
And we've both had just a few days to recover from the big meeting that we went to. And that was great. And we're going to be talking about what?
We're going to be talking about crisis and crisis management, what that can look like in our churches. And we are really fortunate to have an expert in that here on our staff. Chris Turner is going to be joining us.
That's
so
right.
I'm excited.
So I knew Chris working at Lifeway a long time ago, but before that, he was there in Central America with the IMB and several other different places. And then he also served at the IMB after Lifeway. And then he moved on to what we now know as our home, the Tennessee Baptist Mission Board. And we are so delighted to be here. Thank you, Chris, for joining us.
Great. Glad to be here. Glad to be able to have the opportunity.
Chris, I think a lot of times crisis comes upon us suddenly when you think about COVID, and no one was expecting that. And so then churches had to deal with that. What other type of crisis do our churches face?
Yeah, generally crises are categorized in two different types of situations. The first are sudden crises. So it might be tornado comes through and blows a church building around, or COVID hits and all of a sudden, we're facing a pandemic. And the other type is smoldering crises. So you have sudden crises and smoldering. And smoldering crises, things like an active shooter, workplace shooter might be a smoldering crisis. There were most of the research done on active shooters in a workplace. People will say, well, there were things that just kind of happened along, or there might be an instance in a church, maybe something that relates to an impropriety, where there was just some things that were happening along the way, and people go back and they look when they're doing a postmortem on a crisis. They say, I missed the signs. I missed the signs. So those things build. And so those are really the two categories of crises. One of the things I always say is there are two types of organizations, those that have had a crisis and those whose crisis hasn't yet hit.
Oh, that's scary.
And, it's one of those deals that the world is full of adversity, and there's always going to be a crisis. And unfortunately, a lot of the times the crises that we face are crises that we've created for ourselves. They're not some sort of supernatural like weather event or something like that. Usually the crises that organizations face are crises that developed over time that we've really initiated ourselves.
So what's the first thing a church needs to do if they're presented with a crisis?
Yeah, panic is always no, really not panic. Actually, the step that organizations really need to take happens before there's ever a crisis that breaks. And that's discussing what are we going to do when a crisis breaks. Because if you think it's never going to happen, because a crisis could be something as simple as one of the elderly members of your church tripping over the crack in the sidewalk that you've neglected to fix for the past decade, and she catches a heel and falls and breaks a hip. Now that's a crisis. That would be categorized as a crisis. It's a smoldering crisis because we should have fixed the crack in the sidewalk. So if you look at most like safety managers or people that deal with crises, those types of things are categorized. So one of the first thing that needs to happen is, what do we do before a crisis hits, and who needs to be involved in the decision-making process when a crisis hits? Who needs to be the spokesperson for if this goes public, or if it's something we need to communicate within a church or an organization to the people in that organization? Who's the person that's going to speak? Who's the person that's keeping up with a timeline of events? Because you need to, if it's a traumatic type of event, somebody needs to keep track of the timeline, because we've seen in very public crises, like shootings in Texas and other places where the timeline wasn't kept to where there was old information being communicated publicly after newer information had been made public, and it really made those in charge look like they didn't know what they were doing, which they didn't. So the first step is to back up and have a staff meeting that just talks about what would we do if we had a crisis, who needs to be involved, and assign those responsibilities that would manage that crisis.
So when something happens, people can just step right into
Yeah.
action and not have to fumble around figuring out who's in charge, who's doing what. All those
Totally,
things.
because the first 15 minutes when knowledge is gained that there's a crisis. So here's an unfortunate instance that has happened. Youth groups on a trip for the summer, and there's a bus accident, and word gets back to the church that kids may or may not have been hurt or worse. In today's social media environment, somebody there might be actually live streaming that event, or some passerby or something. So as soon as word gets back to church leadership in that particular case, there's not time to fumble around with, okay, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? The reality is that with a plan in place, it's like, okay, here's step one. We need to convene. We need to, you get on making phone calls, and we need to find out, information, because immediate information is critical in managing a crisis well. And managing a crisis well is completely dependent upon a constant flow of accurate information. So who's the person who's going to be tasked with leading out in making sure that information is gotten and that channel is open to be able to then feed that to the group that's meeting to determine how that crisis is going to be managed?
In the local church, is that the pastor? Is that the one that you want?
It doesn't necessarily have to be the pastor. In a smaller church, it might be the pastor simply because of staffing issues. In a larger church, that might be somebody like an associate or an executive pastor, or somebody who is not also going to be responsible for the communication of information. It's easier if there's somebody that's sort of managing the group that has different responsibilities. Like if it looks like it's going to be an ongoing crisis, who's going to go get supper? Who's taking notes in the meeting? I mean, all those things are important to keep up with that information. So, but you need to have somebody that's a logistical coordinator of that. And then you need to have somebody that's like being fed the speaking points as the group decides what needs to be communicated. And then that person is responsible for communicating. But in a smaller church, it's probably going to be the pastor that needs to do all that. But a smaller church might also be able to bring in some assets from within that church. Maybe they've got a businessman or a businesswoman that has some experience, or maybe they're the manager of their company, and they just have some of those skills that enable them to see all of the different pieces that enable that to come together to effectively manage a crisis.
Is there different things that, if the crisis is happens to a church, is there different things that you're communicating internally to church members and externally to the community, if the media is involved or
whatever? That's such a great question, because information needs to stay consistent. Okay. And the biggest reason is you need to know what you said to whom when. Now, when I deal with churches with the crises that they face, I always talk in terms of concentric circles. Like, think about a target. The first, especially in a church context, the bullseye is the church, the people that are connected to that church membership. That's the first audience that needs to be connected to, especially if it's an instance that's happened in the church, maybe related to embezzlement, because that's happened. I've dealt with that. Sexual abuse type stuff, or there's any number of types of instances that come up. So the church is the first group of people that really need to know. Second group of people is really the community. How are you communicating? Something's happened in the community and at your church, what is being communicated. And the biggest reason for that is how a crisis is managed can completely and totally impact a community's perception of that church. And what I mean by that, if a crisis is managed well, even if it's something as tragic as a sexual abuse issue, if that church manages that crisis well, then it gives a level of confidence to the community that that church cares, they're on it, they're responding quickly. And so if the church loses effectiveness in that community, then really the church has lost its reason for being in a large degree, because that's its first mission field. And so you're concerned about that. The third concentric circle, and really as I tell folks I work with, especially in a church context, it's everybody else in the world. And, if somebody in Seattle forms an opinion about your church in Milan, who cares, really? I mean, it's important, but when it's as farther you ripple away from the epicenter of something, there's just no connection to it, and if that's misinformation that's out there, it's not nearly as important to manage. But in that particular situation, a church in the Milan community, it's important for those church members to have confidence in their leadership, and then it's important for the community to have confidence in the church. And so those are the two most important audiences. And then when you talk to those audiences, there may be things you share internally that you wouldn't share externally, but it's not different information. It may be a little more thorough information because you're thinking about who needs to know what and when. And, just because you know this much information doesn't mean that all of that needs to be, everything you know doesn't need to be communicated all the time.
Right.
You communicate the parts that people need to know. For instance, let's just say it is like a sexual abuse situation, and something's been reported and there's an investigation going on. Well, you really can't speak to that investigation. Now, you might be getting some information that is, confidential from an investigator that legally can't be shared, but it's for your awareness. So you might be able to do something like, what we do know is this has been reported. What we do know is an investigator has been assigned to the case, but beyond that, we're really unfortunately not at liberty to say right now. Well, the next important piece of information in a situation like that is, really, I need to know, Mr. Investigator, is there something that has occurred within our church that we need to address while the investigation's going on? And, in a couple of situations that I've dealt with over the past few years, that's the biggest piece of information that I've encouraged the pastor in almost every case to try and get. I don't need you to share the investigation with me. I just need to know, should we be concerned that this individual perpetrated something within our church? And in every case so far, an investigator has been able to say, at this time, we don't see any evidence that something, and so that's something you can tell your church, because you think about a situation like that. Every parent is concerned for their kid, and they want to know if their kid might have been a victim of something. And so, but if you can share, the investigators say at this time, the only information they can share with us is that there's no evidence that anything occurred within our church with this individual. And that's a huge piece of information to share.
So I'll play a little game with you.
All right.
I'm a pastor.
Yep.
Brother Joe has embezzled $100,000.
Yeah.
And it's out on Twitter right now. I'm thinking we just let it ride out.
Yeah.
Let's try to handle this and see if he can pay it back, and let's not say anything to anybody in the church. Is that a good philosophy? What would you say to me?
I would say that's probably not a good approach. And probably, depending on how well I knew you, I'd probably say, "Are you crazy?" No, in a situation like that, I mean, word travels quickly. Mm-hmm. As there's a Jimmy Buffett song that, the Coconut Telegraph, talks about how things travel on the coconut telegraph.
I'm sorry, I only listen to hymns.
Yeah, well, this is for like the 3 people out
Okay,
there
yes,
that've heard
okay,
Jimmy
great,
Buffett
yeah.
that
Go ahead.
the 300,000. But anyway, so
Something about coconuts. Go ahead.
well, people share prayer requests.
Yeah.
And so word is going to travel. And so in a position of leadership, you have a responsibility to communicate accurate, truthful information. I mean, that's not just a biblical responsibility we have. That's just the burden of being in a position of leadership. Really, everybody ought to do that. But if you're in a position of leadership and there's a crisis that's occurred in your organization, when you communicate, you need to communicate accurately and you need to communicate truthful information. And so in that particular situation, you might not have a lot of facts, but you do have enough facts. Let's just say Brother Joe was arrested. Well, you can say, there has been an arrest that's been made. We don't have a whole lot of information at this time. We're working with the investigators to find out, how extensive this is, what the consequences are, what else might have been involved. But at this time, what I can say is that we know that there's been an arrest, an investigation's occurring, and not only do we not have any information that we can share, we just can't share any information at this time legally. Now, one of the big things we need to be, and this is what I tell every pastor, I said, first of all, when you're communicating to your church, you need to remind your church that they have a Christian obligation, a biblical mandate not to gossip. Okay, and then I say, if the Bible doesn't work, then scare them by saying, and you don't want to find yourself inadvertently involved in a lawsuit for defamation of character.
Ouch.
So if the Bible doesn't work, maybe they'll be scared that they're going to lose everything they own because they said something about Brother Joe that wasn't true, and Brother Joe found out that they said that, and then all of a sudden Brother Joe brings a lawsuit against you because you shared a prayer request and there was nothing factual there, and now Brother Joe's been impacted, his financial ability to get a job or whatever, and you find yourself in a defamation lawsuit. So there are consequences when you receive information. You have a responsibility now that you have that knowledge, what you're going to do with that information. And if you feel like you need to go down to the flower shop or over, at the breakfast place and share prayer requests, just recognize, first of all, you're violating a biblical mandate. Second of all, you could wind up in a lawsuit. So in Brother Joe's situation, everybody in the church wants to know what happened to our money. And as especially if you're the pastor, I mean, you're really to a large degree, the treasurer. You're responsible for the money that people in the church give through the church for different missions offerings. You have a responsibility, fiduciary responsibility to those church members to give an accounting of what's happened with their money. And so, you need to come up with some way to talk about that.
So how would you even speak to pastors of whatever size church? I would think when a crisis occurs, obviously there's this communication piece, but there's also the shepherding side of things, of how you manage and shepherd your people well in the midst of, withholding information that you need to, sharing other information, all of that.
Well, one of the things that I say, and I say it sort of jokingly, but not really, always communicate empathy first, and it's even better if you actually mean it. But if you watch events that take place and you watch crises on CNN or Fox or whatever, people will say something that sounds empathetic. And there's a clip I use from a mining incident about 12 years ago when I do media training, and the guy communicates empathy for these mine workers that have, and the thing on a single question from a reporter, his temperament turns to the mine, the cost, the mining union, and all this other. And it's just obvious that really what he's most concerned about is his company, the economic impact, and all that. And these workers that are stuck in a mine are really probably not as high. So communicating empathy, but on the shepherding part, you may have information that you can't share at this time. However, you do have information that you can share, and you can also always express things like, if there's anyone in our congregation that feels like it would be helpful to talk to, one of the church staff members, elder, counselor, please approach one of the staff members and let us know that you would like to talk to someone. Always having that open door so that people that are struggling with it, even if it's in the case of an embezzlement, maybe it's one of Brother Joe's family members that are shocked to find out he's been doing this. And now they're like, because in all situations like that, whether it's sexual abuse or whatever, family members of that person that has committed some sort of impropriety are also victims too. And so there's one particular case I can think of that was really not good at all, not good. And the wife, the daughter, and the son, the son and daughter were both adult children, but they had no idea of what this individual had done, and all the way up into the deposition and the plea bargain. They were still in some denial, and that's when it finally hit. And this was months after. And so as a person in ministry, we're in ministry because of people. And so we always have to consider, how are people dealing with this and processing this, and what can I do? What can I communicate to help that person deal well with the situation, regardless of what it is? Maybe it's a family member or the church that got blown away in a tornado. How do I minister while also leading through a crisis? And it does put a strain on the people that lead. And that's why I strongly encourage, hey, when this is over, or even in the midst of it, if it drags on, you might want to seek some counseling or somebody yourself, because you can't help other people deal with what you're now running on empty on regarding a crisis.
I'm kind of a glass half full kind of guy.
Yeah.
So are there any benefits to a crisis?
Totally there are. There are always benefits because of how well a crisis is managed. So if you're prepared, and it doesn't matter really how bad a situation is, if you're prepared and manage the crisis well, and you and your church, and as we've been talking about, lead well through that, it is a testimony to the church and the community and beyond. So if you lead well through a crisis, people in that church recognize our pastor, our church leadership. They lead well. They know us. They're ministering to us. They're protecting us, and all those types of things. And it gives a level of confidence about church leadership in the community. I mean, it's like, wow, they dealt with adversity well. And so maybe there is something to what it is that they're saying, because they're living out what it is that they're testifying about. So crises are always an opportunity to solidify leadership and strengthen an organization, because crises tend to bring people together. They
Galvanize people.
Not handled well, they obviously cause a split. But I think about the scene in Gladiator when, they're all in the arena and Maximus is saying, whatever comes through those gates, stay together. We can survive this if we stay together. And they circle up and like go shoulder to shoulder and form a circle. And, these chariots come blowing out of there. They're obviously facing a crisis, and they stay together and they survive it. And so it really is, when a crisis hits, it's circling the wagon, people contributing to a team effort to get done whatever needs to get done to manage this crisis well in a way that obviously brings glory to the Lord, because God's not surprised by your crisis.
That's
He
right.
sees it. All crises are smoldering crises to God because He sees all of them happening regardless of what they are. And then, a team that stays together, seeks to glorify the Lord, seeks the Lord's wisdom, and then seeks to minister well to people. It can be an opportunity to really show the strength of who a church is, and how they minister to other people.
Tennessee Baptist Mission Board, how are we supporting churches who face a crisis? If I have a crisis, besides my midlife crisis I'm working on now, if I have an actual crisis,
Well,
how could I receive some help?
Well, what's kind of funny is I'll get a text message from Dr. Davis. It says, "Hey, Pastor so-and-so is about to call you." And I'm like, okay, so let me go up to my office, put my earbuds in because I'm about to be on the phone for the next hour.
Yeah.
I've helped a number of churches over the past 10 years deal with their crisis. It's helpful if not everything is seen as a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
There are some things that are definitely a crisis, and there's some things that,
There are opportunities disguised as crises.
I would say they're more not crises. They're
Yeah.
just kind of something that's overblown. And I think that, reactions by people, and really, honestly, all of the ones that I've dealt with, I'm just going to say I've probably dealt with 20 churches in the past 4 years, and I really wasn't keeping track before COVID. So I'm going to say that number is at least double that over the past 10. I can't think of anything that I haven't been contacted about that wasn't a legitimate, what do we do? And it merited some sort of crisis management. So, I'm glad to talk to a church. There have been a few times that a crisis has been so bad that I've gone out to a church and met with their leadership team, and walk them through, what are the next steps? Because the thing about a crisis is, you can't manage a crisis simultaneously all at once and to the end. It's like, what do I need to deal with right now, and what do I need to account for that's about to come up?
Right.
And that just takes a little bit of helping people understand, because let's face it, I've got way more repetitions in managing and helping people with crises than I ever anticipated I would. And most people don't have that experience. So,
Yeah.
Glad to help walk somebody through and that.
If a church, they're not currently in the middle of a crisis, but they are anticipating something is going to happen because, like you said, it is going to happen. Could they reach out to you to say, hey, can you help us establish a team or anything like that, any kind of training?
Yeah, I'm glad to do that. One of the things that, I've done, and, we used to have, most people would know Mark LeMay. Mark and I used to go to some associations, and he would do, everybody felt like what Mark was going to talk about on risk management was how to keep an active shooter out of your church. And statistically, I think Mark's statistics were like, there's less than a 1% chance that happening is ever going to happen. Your biggest risk is that sidewalk you won't fix.
Right.
Yep.
And so Mark would talk through risk management stuff, and then I would talk through crisis management and then crisis communication. So, I'm glad it's easier if we did that on an associational level.
Yeah.
Where association pulls a group of churches together and can do some kind of 2-3 hour workshop and walk through it. Really, what I've found is there's information that I can communicate, and then there's a whole bunch of questions that I can answer. Because every crisis fundamentally is managed the same, but every single crisis is unique in its crisis. So, I'm glad to talk to a church, and I'm certainly glad to come out and, help an association put on some kind of training that would do that. If you think about if we had 3,200 churches, boy, when would we ever get Summit planned?
That's right.
Anyway.
Well, I'm just glad we don't have 3,200 problems. And,
I'm sure we have 3,200 problems.
We do,
Fortunately,
but
they're
not
all
crises.
at the same time.
And that's the beauty of the cooperative program is that we're here, and our mantra here is we serve churches.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, Chris, for
Man,
serving
my
our
pleasure.
churches.
My pleasure.